it should not surprise you that they are now gearing up to warn everybody and to set the foundation for claiming that Russian disinformation is here again. It's here both because it is what's causing Americans to turn against the war in Ukraine, and because the 2024 election is imminent and the Russians are use the weapon of disinformation to influence our sacred elections. So here's an article from the New York Times, and you're going to see so many of these articles. We've already seen so many of them. They're going to come one after the next. But this is a particularly vivid one that I think is really worth looking at, because it's just so flagrant in terms of how it functions, in terms of the manipulative and deceitful nature of what this instrument is. Here's the New York Times. Look at this headline. Putin's next target, U.S. support for Ukraine, officials say. So right away, let's just observe the fact that the entire article is based on this phrase. Officials say. So what that means is you have people inside the United States government who work in the White House, who work at the Pentagon, who work at the NSA, who work at the CIA, who work at the FBI, officials. And they're saying something. What are they saying? Putin's next target is U.S. support for Ukraine, that the Kremlin is going to start to target America with Russian disinformation in order to erode support for the war in Ukraine. And the entire article, newspapers are supposed to report events in the world. This is not an event in the world. This is a message that the New York Times was dispatched to deliver that came from U.S. officials. So the headline itself, the only real verb here is say. U.S. officials say. That's the only thing that has happened, is that CIA or FBI or national security officials came and told the New York Times something, and that the New York Times is telling you what they want you to know. That's it. That's the whole article. And if you go and look here in the subheadline as well, Russian spy agencies and new technologies could be used to push conspiracy theories, U.S. officials say. So even in the subheadline, you see exactly the same formulation, because this is what the New York Times exists to do. Imagine if you had state media that was not like the New York Times or CNN, but state media that admitted it was state media, that it was there to be the propaganda arm of the government. What state media would do is they would go on TV every day or go into their pages of their newspapers every day, and they would say, the government today proclaims the following. The government today announces this. The government today has decreed that they want you to know the following. That's what the New York Times is. That's what the New York Times does. Look at this. Just writing the headline twice. It's all about what U.S. officials want you to believe. And what they want you to believe is that if you're feeling as though you're starting to question the war in Ukraine, as most Americans are, it's only because you're a victim of Russian disinformation. And we face a danger as a country, namely that Putin is targeting our country with this scary thing called Russian disinformation. And as a result, you need your government to protect you from that, because he's pushing conspiracy theories in order to manipulate public opinion. And how do you get protected from Russian disinformation? You get the government to censor on your behalf to keep you safe from it. That's what all of this is about. Now let's look at the article itself, because it gets even more obvious. And I think it's so important, even though this article is such a skeletal example, a model. It's not even an article. It's not a news article. It's an announcement by the CIA through the pages of the New York Times, explicitly so. It's just so important that everybody stay alert to how this functions. Quote, Russia's strategy to win the war in Ukraine is to outlast the West. But how does Vladimir Putin plan to do that? How does Vladimir Putin plan to do that? What is the answer? How do we know what Vladimir Putin plans to do? American officials said. So here we have that again. Let me just get my little pens working. American officials said, just over and over. That's what this whole article is about. American officials said They are convinced that Mr. Putin intends to try and end U.S. and European support for Ukraine by using his spy agencies to push propaganda supporting pro-Russian political parties and by stoking new conspiracy theories with new technologies. Everything is a conspiracy theory except for the things that the New York Times say. Imagine working for the New York Times and having been the newspaper that convinced Americans that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that Saddam Hussein was in an alliance with Al-Qaeda, that gave itself a Pulitzer for claiming that Russia had taken over the levers of power of the United States through using sexual blackmail over Donald Trump, that watches the entire media claim that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. These are real conspiracy theories, lies. And then you go back a little bit further, and the New York Times was disseminating the claim that the North Vietnamese had attacked the United States in the Gulf of Tonkin. These are the real conspiracy theories that cause wars and that swing elections with lies. That's what the New York Times does. And then they have the audacity to claim that our population is in danger because of Russian disinformation, because American officials say so. The Russian disinformation aims to increase support for candidates opposing Ukraine aid with the ultimate goal of stopping international military assistance to Kiev. Russia has been frustrated that the United States and Europe have largely remained united on continued military and economic support for Ukraine, American officials said. That is what I think is amazing about this article, is what did you learn from this article? The only thing you learn from this article is that the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security want you to think something. What they want you to think is the reason public opinion is turning against the war in Ukraine is not because Americans are finally asking, why am I spending $100 billion for this war? Why am I subjecting myself to the risk of escalation when we can't keep our own country safe, when we can't keep our economy running, when I can't afford basic groceries? They want you to think that the real reason that's happening is not because Americans are turning against it, but because Russian disinformation is manipulating American public opinion, and U.S. officials say that is the entire purpose of this highly promoted New York Times article, and you're going to have so many of these. Whenever they want you to think something is untrue, they're going to tell you the reason people believe it is because of Russian disinformation. Now, last week we ran through this series of events. This was from our show on September 26th. Just to illustrate, I want to just go through this one more time quickly, just to show you how often Western elites blame Russian disinformation for everything and how they use it as an all-purpose excuse. This was all from a one-week period. Let me just go through this video and show you how constantly and how diverse its use is. So here was Justin Trudeau after arguably the most humiliating moment of his career, when he stood next to President Zelensky and applauded a Nazi SS soldier, blaming, you'll never guess, Russia for what happened and warning about Russian disinformation.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are celebrating commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine, as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with.
Okay, so somehow he started talking about applauding a Nazi SS soldier, and he ended babbling about Russian disinformation. Here was the pioneer of this tactic, Hillary Clinton. She was on with Jen Psaki. I'll just give you a little taste of what she said.
And do you think we should be talking about it more?
Well, I think we should be talking about it more, because I don't think, despite all of the deniers, there's any doubt that he interfered in our election, or that he has interfered.
And now look at she's of course is babbling about, she's like, I think we should be talking more about Russian disinformation because we don't talk about Russia enough. And there you see the graphic on the screen. Clinton, we should be talking more about potential Russian election interference in 2024. Do you see what's coming? They're preparing in advance to control the election, to censor information that is threatening to Joe Biden, to engage in all kinds of propaganda by telling you that you're being manipulated by Russian disinformation, that we're being attacked by Russian disinformation, just like we were in 2016 and 2020. And they planned on responding in the same way. So there you see Hillary Clinton.
In many ways, in the internal affairs of other countries, funding political parties, funding, political candidates.
All right, we went through all that. She's claiming that the Russians interfere in our country by funding political parties, These are conspiracy theories. That the Russians are lurking under every bed in the United States, that they're responsible for every change of public opinion, that they're behind everyone who dislikes Hillary Clinton, everybody is a Kremlin agent. This is classic crazed conspiracy theories that these people spew every day, all day. So there you have Justin Trudeau, then you have Hillary Clinton. Here is Fox News talking about why it is that so many people have turned against the war in Ukraine, and watch what they say about why so many Americans are now against Joe Biden's war policies.
Explain to the
I don't understand the hostility toward Ukraine.
American public.
A lawyer, I do try to understand the other side. I do not understand the hostility toward Ukraine. Belittling Zelensky, calling it Ukraine's war against Russia. Have I missed something?
Trey, I think the only way to understand that is that Russian disinformation has been able to mold some aspects of the information flow into our country as well as into some European countries. They've been laying the groundwork for this. Putin's been laying the groundwork for this for a long time and been seeding the ground with that sort of notion that Ukraine is a corrupt country and that...
Isn't that amazing? That's Fox News saying, hey, we don't understand. Why are people turning against the war in Ukraine that Joe Biden is fighting? And Jennifer Griffin says it's because of Russian disinformation. They're manipulating people to believe all sorts of bad things about Ukraine, and that's the reason why people are turning it. This is Fox News, sounding just like Hillary Clinton, sounding just like Justin Trudeau. And then the last example was from The Economist, which is about the fact that Niger kicked out France, expelled French troops, saying we don't want France here anymore. At the same time, a lot of countries in Africa are developing positive relations with both Russia as well as the broader BRICS alliance. And so The Economist wanted to explain to you why the people of Niger did something like kick France out and why they're starting to think better about Russia. And here was their explanation. Yet the French decision to quit Niger is about much more than this. It is partly a pragmatic recognition that the junta was not going to budge and that regional countries, despite their threats, were unlikely to try to dislodge it from power. The decision also marks a reluctant and painful realization in Paris that its influence on the continent has taken a severe knock. In the eyes of a generation of young Nigerians, and partly thanks to the efficiency of Russian disinformation campaigns, France is now regarded as the problem, not the solution. So a country decides we've suffered decades of this foreign power exploiting our resources and raping our country and exploiting us in all sorts of ways, and we want them gone. And The Economist jumps in and says, oh, the reason they really think that is because of Russian disinformation. Now, none of these people ever bother to say, what is Russian disinformation? We showed you before that Washington Post article that warned, based on an EU study, that Twitter and Facebook and Google were allowing too much Russian disinformation to flow by not censoring enough. And the study, if you dig into it as we did, essentially says that Russian disinformation means anything that aligns with the Pentagon's interests. So if you're opposed to the war in Ukraine, if you're opposed to NATO and US support for the war in Ukraine for the end of time, you align with the Kremlin's interests, and automatically that gets counted as pro-Russian propaganda. That's what they mean by this. But just look at how they use it for everything. And now they're using it to say that in the 2024 election, Russian disinformation is coming and we need to prepare for it. Mark Zuckerberg, in an interview he did with Lex Friedman in June of this year, was asked about the fact that Facebook ended up censoring so much information from that platform because the US government demanded it. And here's what he said about why that happened.
So misinformation, I think, is has been a really tricky one because there are things that are kind of obviously false, right, that are maybe factual, but may not be harmful. So it's like, all right, are you going to censor someone for just being wrong? It's, if there's no kind of harm implication of what they're doing, I think there's a bunch of real kind of issues and challenges there.
And then he goes on to say essentially that what happened with COVID is that they ended up censoring a lot of things that ended up being debatable or even correct at the request of the US government. There's another Mark Zuckerberg interview where he was being asked about why Facebook ended up censoring the reporting about Hunter Biden. And what Mark Zuckerberg said is something that we now know from the Twitter files is true, which is that all throughout 2020, as we headed into the 2020 election, where Donald Trump defeated Joe Biden, the FBI was issuing constant warnings saying, look, the Russians are going to interfere in our election in 2020 just like they interfered in 2016. And you need to be ready for that. And they were priming these social media companies to say, if there's some kind of new reporting about Joe Biden that appears that might threaten his interest or threaten his campaign, you should know it's probably Russian disinformation and you should be ready to stop it. And that was the reason why Yoel Roth has said this, Twitter executives have said it, here's Mark Zuckerberg said it in a different interview, that the reason that happened is because the FBI kept warning them that Russian disinformation was going to influence the 2020 election just like it did 2016, and they needed to be ready for it. Now, one of the things that happened in the lead up to the 2020 election that I think has gotten way too little attention is that just like is happening now, and this is why I'm showing it to you, this is why I think it's so important, the way they're now saying, and I showed you that graphic from the Hillary Clinton interview with Jen Psaki, 2024, the Russians are planning again to interfere in our election with Russian disinformation. You need to be prepared for it. Is leading up into 2020, the media outlets that had reported on Hillary Clinton's emails in 2016 that were released by WikiLeaks felt as though they had helped Donald Trump win, and they were determined not to make that mistake again, which is what they considered it, a mistake. I heard at The Intercept all the time. I remember the night that Donald Trump won and Hillary Clinton lost, people were crying in the Slack rooms that we were having, and they were saying, I think we need to apologize for the role that we played in helping Donald Trump win, because we did a lot of reporting about what those emails revealed about Hillary Clinton, the ones that were given to WikiLeaks that WikiLeaks published, because of course we were going to report on those emails. Those are authentic emails. Those are in the public interest and about somebody who was running for president. And most media outlets reported on those emails, but leading into 2020, they felt like they had done something wrong by doing their job as journalists, because that reporting helped Donald Trump. And in their minds, even though that was just basic journalism, it was morally unjustified to do anything to help Donald Trump, even if what you're doing is just basically your basic job as a journalist, which is reporting on relevant materials. And so leading into the 2020 election, with all these warnings about how Russian disinformation was coming, major media outlets changed their policies that had existed forever that said, if in 2020 this time we get hacked information, this time we're not going to report it the way we did in 2016. They changed their policies. All of journalism changed their defining core ethos to ensure that there'd be no reporting that would help elect Donald Trump again or help defeat Joe Biden. So here from Vanity Fair in September of 2020, right before the election, a couple months before the 2020 election, you see the headline, Marty Baron, who was the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, warns the Washington Post staff about covering hacked materials. And the article says, quote, nearly 4 years since the Podesta email dump blew up the 2016 race, the Post's top editor urges his newsroom to slow down in handling leaks and beware of echoing propaganda. And there was all kinds of reports about how the media outlets were going to look at this information, and even if the information were true, even if it were authentic, even if it were in the public interest, the way the Hillary Clinton emails were, they were going to change how they report and perhaps not report it this time. And it sounds like it's kind of an inside baseball question about journalistic ethics, but what it really showed me, and I was screaming about it at the time when I read it because I knew what this meant, was that these journalistic outlets were explicitly saying they're no longer going to do journalism. They weren't going to report information that incriminated Joe Biden the way they reported on the information that WikiLeaks published about Hillary Clinton, because they decided their overarching duty was to ensure Donald Trump lost and Joe Biden won, even if it meant abdicating their responsibilities as journalists. And it isn't just that they threatened to do that. As that Vanity Fair article just reported, Marty Barron, the head of the Washington Post, was saying he would do. They did it. That's exactly what they did. In 2020, right before the 2020 election, when that material became available from Hunter Biden's laptop, and there was all these stories to report about the financial and ethical misconduct in which not just Hunter Biden had engaged, but Joe Biden had engaged, or at least a lot of questions to ask, instead of reporting on that, instead of asking those questions, they said, we're going to ignore that story because it's Russian disinformation. I find that to be the greatest scandal in journalism in decades, if not ever. And the reason why I'm delving into this is because this is what they're saying they're going to do again. This is why they're warning that Russian disinformation is coming again in 2024. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.